Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So, you may have noticed actually, I'm a bit late this week. It's been my habit since starting this channel to release a new video every Sunday. And here we are going live on a Tuesday. This is partly because it's been an unusually busy time for me, and so it's taken me a bit longer to get my act together. But it's also occurred to me that it might be better to release Platonic Soul during the week anyway. Actually, do you have any opinions about when you'd like to see Platonic Soul come out? If you do, feel free to leave a comment. Anyway, on to today's topic. Today we'll be looking again at this wonderful dialogue, the Phaedrus. One thing I've mentioned about the Phaedrus is that it is fundamentally about the problem of the unity of the psyche or soul or self. And the passage we're looking at today will bring that out especially strongly, I think. And that's closely tied up in one of the things that makes today's passage especially remarkable, which is that it shows us possibly the one time that Socrates talks about being personally afraid of something. If you know of any others, I'd love to hear of them. But this is the only one that I know of. I think the fear that Socrates shows here is actually quite important to the overall theme of this series. How Plato's theory of love can change your life. And I hope to explain by the end of this episode why that fear is one we all share, or at least all should share. As wild as this may sound, I actually think in a certain way, everything depends on it. If you've been fortunate enough to have read much of Plato, you'll understand quite easily, I think, why fear seems so out of character for Socrates. Courage and even humor in the face of adversity and even mortal danger is one of the most striking attributes of Plato's Socrates. We see, for example, the war hero Alcibiades praise Socrates toward the end of the symposium, after he comes stumbling in drunk, for his ability to endure hardship during war, and also for saving his life during combat. Alcibiades says, "I'd been wounded and he refused to leave me, and he got me out of it too, armor and all." And then a bit later mentions Socrates' almost casual way of glancing sidelong at enemy soldiers. He says, his sideways glance was just as unconcerned whether he was looking at his own friends or at the enemy. We have the same calm confidence reflected, I think, in that wonderful closing of the Republic, except in an existential sense. "We shall fare well," are the last words of it. This huge masterpiece. The courage of Socrates actually seems to be the note that some key dialogues end on. We have, for example, Socrates calmly telling the jury at the end of the apology, his defense speech. This is actually once he's been sentenced to die and the trial is winding up, we have him calmly saying, "Now it is time that we were going. I to die and you to live. But which of us has the happier prospect is unknown to anyone but God," or the God, depending on how you want to translate this ha theos. Another dialogue, the Phaedo, relates Socrates calmly philosophizing and encouraging his friends while waiting for and eventually drinking and dying from the hemlock that he's been ordered to take. And so we're hardly surprised when at the end of that dialogue, the narrator describes this character, understandably, as the bravest man known in his time. So where does this moment of Socratic fear come in? You may remember from last time that the young Phaedrus had recited a kind of anti-erotic speech, one in which he argued that it's better to be in a sexual relationship with one who does not have erotic feelings for you because of all the wild irrationality that eros supposedly gives rise to. And Socrates is unimpressed by the speech, but initially, for the simple reason he feels he could give a better one, arguing the same point. And so we see in the speech that he now gives a view of eros that we saw, at least superficially, in the Republic, as an essentially irrational force within the psyche. I mentioned before how, though on the surface this dialogue may seem to be a discussion about eros in the narrow sense of sexual passion, in this speech Socrates seems to hint at that wider sense of the entire desiring part or aspect of the self. He gives us a definition of eros in the narrow sense only after launching into his speech with a description of the psyche as essentially divided between these rational and irrational, or you might say, judging and desiring elements. He says this: each of us is ruled by two principles, which we follow wherever they lead. One is our inborn desire for pleasures. The other is our acquired judgment that pursues what is best. Sometimes these two are in agreement, but there are times when they quarrel inside us. And then sometimes one of them gains control, sometimes the other. And by the way, I'm using the 2006 translation by C.D.C. Reeve, except where I in places substitute the original Greek. For example, eros, where Reeve's version says love. So the rule of the pleasure drive, Socrates says, results in hubris, this unbalanced, out-of-control state that is sometimes translated into English as pride. It's not really an exact translation. And the rule of the controlling or judging principle brings out a state of sophrosune, or moderation. Eros, Socrates says, he seems to mean it here, in that narrow sense, is this pursuit of pleasure in beauty as it appears in bodies. And he uses a bit of creative etymology to bring his point home. He says, the unreasoning desire that overpowers a person's considered impulse to do right and is driven to take pleasure in beauty, its force reinforced by its kindred desires for beauty in human bodies. This desire, all conquering in its forceful drive, takes its name from the word for force, which is rome, and is called eros, because those words sound sort of similar. Socrates follows up this definition by depicting eros, much as Lysias had done in the speech Phaedrus just recited, as a kind of sickness that makes one a slave to pleasure, and arguing that for this reason, the attentions of a lover, an erastes, are not good. Now here comes the passage I was talking about. Almost immediately after he finishes that speech and is preparing to cross a river to go back to Athens, Socrates suddenly becomes aware of a sense of having committed a grave transgression. Almost from the beginning of my speech, I was disturbed by a very uneasy feeling, he says. As Ibyicus, that's a lyric poet, puts it, that for offending the gods I am honored by men. But now I understand exactly what my offense has been. He tells Phaedrus his speech was foolish and close to being impious, and he asks, what could be more horrible than that? And he then asks Phaedrus, don't you believe that Eros is the son of Aphrodite? Isn't he one of the gods? So at this point, some of you may want to step in and say, well, didn't Diotima say in the Symposium that Eros isn't a god, but a daimon, an intermediary between gods and humans? So I guess my response to that is to say that there's actually a fair bit of inconsistency in the way that ancient Greeks referred to the immortals, with the term god and goddess sometimes being used kind of loosely. In the Odyssey, for example, Homer refers to the nymph Calypso as a goddess. I think this notion many of us have that religion must involve creeds seems to bring with it an expectation of a certain amount of fixity in the terms that are used in myth, or at least our own experience of thinking of creeds as a sort of necessary element of religion. But I don't think Greek myth was bound by this kind of lexical fixity, and this actually includes the philosophical myths of Plato too. I think this is one of the reasons why he sees mythical language as imperfect. Later in the dialogue, he'll actually talk about the potential of the image of eros he's used here to convey truth, but also to lead listeners astray. But the thing is, he sees it as necessary sometimes because subjects are often too difficult for philosophy to treat of using ordinary language. And eros is one of those. Anyway, Socrates decides he must try to atone for the offense by making another speech, this one in praise of eros. But if eros is a god or something divine, which he is, he can't be bad in any way. And yet our speeches just now spoke of him as if he were. That is their offense against eros. And they've compounded it with their utter foolishness in parading their dangerous falsehoods and preening themselves over perhaps deceiving a few silly people and coming to be admired by them. And so, my friend, I must purify myself. I'll try to offer my palinode to eros before I am punished for speaking ill of him. The effects of eros among the virtuous, Socrates proposes, are not the same as those among the vicious, which is why he feels shame now to have given an anti-erotic speech before the virtuous Phaedrus. This is when he mentions his fear. That man makes me feel ashamed, and as I'm also afraid of eros himself, I want to wash out the bitterness of what we've heard with a more tasteful speech. Now, I think you could argue that there's something not quite serious about Socrates' tone when he talks about being fearful here. And perhaps there's some truth to that, at least superficially. But as is often the case, something deadly serious is hiding here, I think, behind that Socratic smile. I actually don't have any doubt that Plato's Socrates fears eros. As he says in another dialogue, the Euthyphro, one fears what one reverences. One feels one needs to be on the good side of it. And I think it's quite possible that he reverences eros about as much as he reverences anything. And the same thing, I think, goes for Plato himself. The 2nd century AD geographer Pausanias mentioned in his writings that there was an altar to eros at the entrance to Plato's academy. And this, I think, fits what we know and can infer about Plato. Why? There's a short answer to this, which Socrates gives himself. Eros, he says, is a god, and the gods are good. But my strong suspicion is that and powerful, of course. But my strong suspicion is that the short theological argument Socrates gives here is backed by a somewhat more complex philosophical one, which I think must go something like this. The good is the principle of being and truth, as we've seen, and it's also the one. And so the truth, or if you like, ultimate truth of any being must be its goodness and its unity. And this must be true of the psyche also. And so, on the one hand, one can speak, as Socrates did in his first speech, and also through much of Plato's Republic, in a way, of the psyche as being divided into these rational and irrational parts. And this is certainly the way we often seem to ourselves. And yet, as Socrates also told us near the very end of the Republic, on the other hand, this cannot be the last word on the psyche, the true nature of which we discern only with the greatest difficulty. Remember that amazing images of Glaucus, the sea god, all with limbs ripped off and obscured by all these barnacles and sea creatures that had become encrusted onto him. This is what it's like for us to try to see the real nature of the psyche, Plato says. The psyche must have a unity at its heart, actually. It must have an essential unity beyond these superficial divisions. Now, the key thing here, I think, is that Socrates is saying that to argue that the soul is essentially or fundamentally divided in that way is not just incorrect, it's also massively dangerous. It's a frequent theme of Plato's Socrates. And we saw to say that it's dangerous. And we saw this also in the Republic, that a lapse into self-division because of an ignorance of the psyche's true nature is the very cause of evil and unhappiness. That's the frequent theme of Socrates, especially in the Republic. Tyranny in both the state and the psyche is this chaotic condition in which there's no inner principle that would give unity. Tyranny, Plato says, happens when the idea that once unified a soul or a society is for some reason no longer able to do so. And so one of the central messages of the Republic is that the health of both self and society requires the uniting or reintegration of its parts through the rediscovery of a vision not of some limited good, but of the good itself, a good that won't fail it. And as something of an aside, perhaps there's some way for us to do this as a society today, to see the good as it is, while not sacrificing secularity, something I think at least most of us treasure quite highly. And maybe philosophy is that way. Anyway, now I think we get to the reason for the fear that his first speech has suddenly put into Socrates. We can sum up his courage by saying that Socrates cares for the state of his psyche, for his goodness, more than he cares for life itself, or at least life as we mundanely conceive it. His one fear, really, is that he will do evil. But since lapsing into self-divide, which he also sees as more or less synonymous with misery, but since lapsing into self-dividedness is the cause of evil, and failing to see the principle of unity in the psyche is the cause of lapsing into self-dividedness, any speech that suggests the psyche is by nature divided against itself, an anti-erotic one, for example, must pose the greatest threat. This great fear he has mentioned of offending the god is a great fear that he will see himself as essentially self-divided, as fated, in a way, not to have any unifying principle. And that means, basically, fated to do evil and to fall into despair. You might remember I said a few minutes ago that this fear is something we should all share, and that everything in a way depends on it. That's because, as we saw in the first few episodes of this series, the problem of self-dividedness isn't just a Platonic one, but universal, even if not everybody shares the principles of Plato's philosophy. This sense of being divided between rational and irrational parts, thinking and feeling, in such a way that they can't be reconciled or integrated, is, I think, and as I mentioned, the great problem of being human. The theme that they might be by nature in conflict with one another crops up generally in human culture as the cause of despair. And so we should all share Socrates' fear of giving offense to Eros, because the unqualified disparagement of our desire is a kind of recognition or admission that we are hopelessly divided against ourselves. And I'm about to run out of power here, but luckily my power cord is nearby. And somehow the goal of philosophy, I think, must be to bring these to unity, to show, in other words, how Eros, in that wider sense especially, that in us which feels, must somehow be for the good. And this is what, as we'll see, Socrates will attempt to do in his next speech, one of the most powerful and important passages, in my view, in the entire Platonic corpus. Anyway, we'll be unpacking or trying to unpack that over the next few episodes, and I hope you can join me then. Until then, be well, and thanks for watching.